And I'm assuming you have like some kind of a spiel that you tell
Yeah,
people at the beginning.
a little bit. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to give it a few minutes before we really get started, wait until 4 o'clock on the money. But my name is Katrina. I am the events coordinator for the Toadstool Bookshop in Keene. We have locations in Keene, Peterborough, and Nashua, New Hampshire. We're joined today by author Phuc Tran of Portland, classicist, high school teacher, writer, grammar nerd, Star Wars enthusiast, punk rock aficionado, and tattoo artist. We're discussing his book today, Saigon, a misfits memoir of great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in, which is available at www.toadbooks.com. And all three of our stores, give us a ring or stop in. We're open every day of the week. It's 4 o'clock, so I'm gonna get started. Phuc, I would love it if you would read us a small excerpt of your book. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I'll just read the beginning. So, for those of you who I guess are curious, so my book is a coming of age story, and it's about really growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, as the only refugee, only Vietnamese family for a long time. Our settlement there was part of, after our family fled Saigon in 1975, we were resettled in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and as part of a federal policy called the refugee dispersion policy, the federal government specifically did not want to settle Vietnamese families together because they didn't want them to form ethnic enclaves. I think the idea there was that this would sort of speed up assimilation and acculturation and all those things, language acquisition. So that's how we ended up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that's where I grew up in the late 70s and the 80s. And as you can imagine, it was totally smooth, and that's what the book is about, right? Yeah, just kidding. So I thought I'd just read a beginning from the beginning of the book about it's a description of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Senior High School sprawled as a monolithic mid-century modern block of types, archetypes, and stereotypes. Industrial gray lockers ringed its hallways, the compartments narrow enough to repel most of your textbooks, but wide enough to collect the trash and detritus from your backpack. It was your own personal landfill. Linoleum floors, classrooms with chables, the combo chair tables of the 70s, blackboards, American flags, loudspeakers from which the wah, wah, wah of adult speak would drone. Our school district was so large that the juniors and seniors had their own separate high school, the so-called senior high school, and the freshmen and sophomores had their own underclassmen high school building. Carlisle High School stocked its seats and bleachers with a familiar cast from the 80s, the athletes who towered above the rest of us, the cheerleaders who lay supine beneath them, the geeks with their physics books under their arms, the preps with their tree-torns, swatches, and impeccable Benetton sweaters, a handful of black kids with MC Hammer pants and tall square afros, tightly faded, punks and skaters with their leather jackets and black Converse, a few swirly hippies, the rednecks with their oily palms and cigarettes and trucks. Carlisle High School was another cultural cul-de-sac, built with the craftsman blueprint of John Hughes, the Frank Lloyd Wright of teen malaise. Overwhelmingly white, Carlisle's population offered all the rainbows of Caucasia. The town's main employers were Dickinson College, the Army War College, and the smoky stack of factories, and the service industries that had sprung up to support the aforementioned trifecta. In the spirit of public education, we progeny were all in the mix together. The itinerant army brats, the ivory sons and daughters of professors, doctors, and lawyers, the greasy offspring of waiters, cooks, and factory workers, and the token refugee family. The Tran family blended right into the mix, like proverbial flies in the ointment. That is to say, we didn't. Carlisle's glitter was unmistakably 80s, but its structure was straight from the post-war era, bricked together by the mortar of the 50s. We had a downtown Woolworths with a chrome lunchnet counter and red vinyl stools, and the grand movie theater with its incandescent marquee. The four corners of Carlisle's town square were righted by two courthouses and two churches, Episcopalian and Presbyterian. God and law and God. It wasn't a subtle message to any of us living in Carlisle, what was at the heart of the town. And the pièce de résistance, our high school was the town's designated Cold War fallout shelter. The blue and yellow radiation placards festooned our hallways, reminding us that we were only a button push away from nuclear annihilation. From what I gleaned on television, Carlisle seemed like a slice of American pie a la mode. We bottled lightning bugs on summer nights. Trucks flew Confederate flags. We loitered at 7-Elevens and truck stops. We shopped at flea markets and shot pellet guns. My high school provided a daycare for girls who had gotten pregnant but were still attending classes. We stirred up marching band pride and fomented football rivalries. The auto shop kids rattled by in muscle cars and smoked in ashen cobbles before the first period bell. We were rural royalty, Dairy Queens and Burger Kings. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
It's always great to hear an author read their own writing. I read your book and I loved every page of it, or most pages of it, because it's hard to love everything 100%. And there were a few blank pages in there. I don't know if you know that. Just before the title page and just after the acknowledgements, there's a blank piece of paper.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. Maybe it's for like doodling or taking notes or something.
How would it make you feel if somebody took notes about your memoir?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I guess I would feel flattered, but I'm not sure what you would make of it, I guess. I think it's for doodling, really. You can draw pictures of my friends, draw pictures of like kids skateboarding. I actually would love it if people doodled in it more than took notes. But anyway, yeah.
No, I think that would be very cool. And I think it speaks too to the nature of the book. Be unconventional.
Yeah. It's really like DIY, right? Yeah.
Very punk rock.
Yeah, totally.
So this book is structured around 12 different pieces of great literature that spoke to you in some way. For instance, the Iliad, the Metamorphosis by Kafka. Let's see, what else was in there?
Crime and Punishment.
Importance of Being Earnest. Yeah. Oh, so many.
Yeah.
So I know that I've read that you started with the prologue. You were approached after your TED Talk kind of went viral and really took off, which, by the way, if you haven't seen his TED Talk on YouTube, please go watch it. It's it's a few minutes of your day and it's totally worth it. So you started the prologue and you kind of developed the rest of your memoir after the prologue. So did you develop the memoir around the books, or did you start writing snippets and then say, oh, you know what, this book that I read really makes me think of this time in my life. Maybe I can kind of expound upon that.
Yeah, when I wrote the prologue for my agent, it was, I sort of didn't know what she wanted, and I think she was just sort of like worried that like, I had an interesting story, but like it didn't have like the writing chops to, sort of execute or tell the story in an interesting way. And so I just sort of wrote it like, I just thought, well, what would be the thing that I would want to read as a reader myself? And so I just sort of thought, okay, well, I'm just going to talk about like, punk rock and Star Wars and grammar and literature. And so I wrote the prologue and sort of, talked a lot about pop culture and 80s pop culture, and then, refracted it all through the narrative of the picture of Dorian Gray. And that's sort of how my brain works anyways. I'm always sort of triangulating things either through books or through movies or music or whatever, and then so it was my agent's thought. She read it and she loved it, and then she said, could you do this for the rest of the book? And I thought, that's easy. I mean, I think because like I think and it's not a spoiler, but I think going through my early life or my, coming of age years. Like, I think I leaned so heavily on great books as a way to connect with people and make sense of what happened that, like, I was sort of naturally doing it anyway. So, so like the Metamorphosis, for example, like I think I've always, as soon as I read that, like the light bulb went on for me, and I was like, oh, even if that's not what Kafka intended, right? Like it really, for me, like it really resonated as a teenager. And I think like that's like sort of like a teenager's superpower in a weird way, is like when kids, especially teenagers, read things like they're asking themselves, like, what does this say about my life? Like, what does this say about me? Like, they're not really looking, like there's like that analogy of like literature as either windows, mirrors, or was it windows, mirrors, or doors, right? Is that right? And so I think like teenagers are always looking for the mirror, right? Like I think like, I think with the guidance of a teacher, like it can turn into a window and maybe even a door, but I think teenagers are always looking for reflections of themselves in the things that they read first and foremost. I think it's just a natural instinct. So anyway, yeah, that's
No,
yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. And to a certain extent too, I would argue that what the author wrote stops being theirs the second a reader puts it in their hands. And I think that what you have done is very true to the nature of literature, is to take a great piece of literature, a piece of art, culture, story, and somehow make it personal to yourself. And I think that really shines in throughout this book. I think my favorite was the importance of being earnest. That chapter, again, most teenagers are looking for a way to see themselves in what they're reading in school, whether they have to or not, what they're reading at home, whether they have to or not. And there's a lot of truth to, the lie that I've been telling is what's been true all along.
Thanks.
Very neat.
Yeah, I think I have not met anyone else who's picked that chapter out as like their favorite. So thanks. It's one of my personal favorites too. So thanks, sir.
I loved the play. Madcap, and it's also startlingly honest. It took me until probably my second or third read through to start catching things that the first time I read it, we read it and watched it in high school in AP English, like many other AP students do. And I remember appreciating a lot of that then, but as you keep reading, the duality really speaks to you. It's just very cool. Anyway.
Thanks.
Well done, bravo.
Thanks. And also, I think just to amplify what you're saying, I think it's so interesting. I think like it's also, I think people are so reluctant to revisit things and then outgrow them, but I think it's so powerful and interesting when you revisit books. Like I think it's happening to Catcher in the Rye right now. Like I think for some people it's not aging well, and then for a whole generation of readers, like they're reading it and they're like, who is this kid? Like, like and I think that's okay. Like I think, a book that was your favorite book when you were 15 or 18 or whatever, like when you're, a middle-aged, person and you're reading it, like maybe it's not, and that's okay. Like I think it's amazing when the books that you're reading can grow with you and age with you and, sort of respond to, like meaning like the whole canon of books, right, can be that way. To me, it seems so much more stultifying to have to be like, well, these are my 12 favorite books and they'll never change. Like that
Right.
Seems, I don't know about that.
No. And I think that's the great thing about people, is we're constantly growing and changing. And that in and of itself is a huge theme throughout your book. Not only your growth and your changing, but noticing, how your family has grown and changed from being refugees from Vietnam in your very early formative years to who they are when you graduate high school, who in some ways they're the same people and in some ways they're not. When you were revisiting your life to rewrite this book, to revisit your life, write this book.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about your relationship with your parents and your relationship with your brother. I admire the frankness in all of your writing, especially through that. It's not an easy thing to write about and to honor, the child that you were when terrible things happen to you and terrible things happen around you. And I thought that you balanced honoring young Phuc very, very well with honoring, your parents and what they were trying to do, whether or not they succeeded. How did you balance your role as their son with your role as Lou's brother? Because I loved reading the brothers.
Thanks.
I really did. I have a younger sister. We're 2 years apart, and we either tear each other apart or we're best friends. It really depends on the minute. And I'm just always interested in sibling narratives. And, you know, growing up, sometimes the older sibling does take the brunt of the heat from the parents, whether or not it's deserved. You're like, all right, well, if you're going to yell at one of us, might as well be me. Did you find that revisiting that kind of brought that back up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's definitely not the sort of book that, and thanks for acknowledging all of that, I think, and the sort of the balancing act or the threading of the needle, as it were. Pick whichever metaphor you want. I really appreciate your noticing it. It was tricky, and I think if I had even tried to write this book 10 years ago, I don't think I could have done it. Shout out to mental health and like all the counseling and sort of therapy that I did to sort of make sense of it. And I did that for my own self, so I think when I found out that I was going to be a parent, I just thought, okay, like, if my only role as a son, right, is in the parent-child dynamic, right, in that binary of being either a parent or a child, if my role as a child is, damaged or sort of not, if there are still some like sort of rough spots or hiccups in it, like I felt like how could that not affect my role as a parent, right? It's the other side of the coin. So that's, when we found out that we were going to have our first daughter, I was like, okay, time to go to counseling. I guess I'm going to like dig this stuff up. And so that was so therapeutic. So for me, the writing piece of it wasn't quite as therapizing as it would have been, I think. But I think like having gone to counseling and worked through all that stuff, like it really allowed me to look at my sort of history and my parents' history with a very clear eye. And I didn't want to sort of resort to historical revisionism. So like I really wanted to be frank, and I think, as you said, like honor my experience, like not downplay things, definitely not sweep things under the rug. And frankly, like there's, I have a functioning relationship with my parents. So I think like, your question about like, how do I manage my role as like their son? I mean, I think, my relationship with them is still not like it's not great, but it works, like, I mean, like they send my kids birthday gifts and things like that, but I wasn't writing it worried that I would hurt anyone's feelings, I guess. Like I wasn't afraid of damaging a relationship because my relationship was so, kind of minimal or thin, as it were. But I somebody else said to me, that like there's a piece of memoir advice, and the advice is, when you write memoir, pretend that everybody is dead. And so like, I mean, yeah, I mean, I didn't do that, but I think you could certainly get the sense that like I'm just there to sort of talk about my experience and things from my perspective. And but I don't think it came across that I was being sort of overly mean or or cruel or vindictive. Like I think my hope was that like I wanted to portray everybody and their complexity, both myself and my parents. Yeah.
Yeah, the complexity is definitely a theme, because you are so complex. You are a classic scholar, and you teach high school Latin, and also you're a phenomenal artist, and you have a successful tattoo business. You can't be pigeonholed. And I think that I think that none of the people in your life, the portraits that you paint with your words, I don't think any of these people can be pigeonholed. And I think that's really beautiful. Really beautiful, even when they're doing less than beautiful things.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
of course.
Well, and I think it's like, I hope it's like an invitation to the reader, like above all, like to consider their own complexity, right? Like that we are really complicated people, and we can be paradoxical, and our lives can't be boiled down into sort of 140 character tweets, and like the grid on Instagram or whatever. Like we're messy, we're humans, right? And that's inherently messy. Yeah.
Was there anything that you were afraid to kind of bring up to yourself while you were writing? Which parts were the hardest, I guess, for you? Was it being objective, or was it putting yourself back in your younger mindsets? Were you able to do that? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I would say for sure. Like I think I think I think that the tricky thing, or the thing that was the most challenging, was to revisit sort of specifically, like, sort of traumatizing or very difficult times in my life, and then write them in a way that felt urgent and real, so it's a little bit of like, picking the scab so that there's a little bit of blood, so that there's like, so that the passages feel vibrant, and they don't feel sort of like, too removed, or like the action doesn't feel anesthetized, as it were. So that was, so those are like long days or hard days when I would come home, and it would be kind of like, I would be a little bit of like an emotional zombie, because I'd just be like, like I just had to, spend like 8 hours writing, some hard scenes. But again, I think, like, shout out to mental health, like I think I was in a place where I could like go there, write the thing, and then come home and kind of like, have a cocktail and detox a little bit.
I think that's incredibly important, is to find that balance of what's too much for me and what's not.
Yeah, for sure. And on my writing notebook, I had a little thing that I taped to it, and it said, whatever the thing that you're most afraid to write that. And I think that was just a reminder for me to be, to take risks and to be bold, that if the book ended up being a flop, at least, it didn't do well because, it wouldn't be because I didn't take any risks. But, because I think when I read books, like, I always want to feel like the author also, went out there on a limb and tried something new, or sort of personally revelatory or challenging. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's incredibly honest, and I think that authenticity is a strength. Speaking of authenticity, that is the crux of the punk rock culture, of the DIY punk rock culture of the late 70s all the way through, today, whether or not it looks the same as it did in the 70s when it was born. So authenticity, DIY, standing up to injustice. You talk about all of these things that seem very prescient today, like punching Nazis.
No, I know, right? It's like 22 years later, they're still doing this. Yeah.
You talk about standing up to these small moments of injustice where you can. Do you feel like that mindset of punk rock, that very much, DIY ethos, do you think that's carried through your entire life? Do you still feel like like, yes and no, it doesn't?
Yeah, no, for sure.
In what ways do you think that those formative lessons in your skate punk years still are ringing true for you?
Yeah, I think it's such a funny question. I love that question. Yeah, and I think it's tough, right? It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing, meaning that, like, our kids who are natural rule breakers and sort of, limit pushers, like, do they find punk rock, or is it, that, like, the punk rock turns them into, rule breakers? I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, like, I was already sort of like chafing against my family's expectations, and so there was like already tension there in my family. And so I think, like, as soon as I discovered punk rock, and I think many kids do, right? Like, as soon as you hear or you find like a subculture, you hear a song that is saying something that is so specific to how you're feeling, it feels really powerful, right? To not feel alone and to find a tribe, and all of a sudden, like, you've got this like instant like group of people who all feel as disaffected as you do, or feel just as disconnected. I mean, I think for me especially, like, like, in my own sort of naive way, I thought, oh, like, white kids, they must have it so easy, like, I mean, they're, like, they're just on top of like this power structure, right? And to meet all of these like white punk rock kids, and complaining about how their parents didn't understand them either, I was like, oh man, like, that must be even more frustrating, right? Like, I just thought, well, God, I mean, if like you're like this like suburban white kid, and your parents don't get you, like, what hope do I have, right? So, like, I think, like, we really connected in that way. But to circle back to your question, like, I think like the punk rock iconoclasm for sure has carried through for me. Like, I think I chafe definitely at being pigeonholed. Like I also am a rule breaker, I guess. I don't, in the sense that like if the rules feel restrictive, right, and if there's like no sense to them, or
Right. You're unconventional.
yeah, but and I think and I'm not sure if that is like I think like even if it didn't have like the moniker of punk rock, like I would,
Yep.
I mean, you think about like sort of like the spiritual forefathers of punk rock, like, Henry David Thoreau, where he's just like, I hate everybody. I'm going to go live in a cabin in the woods and write about it, like, so there are lots of people before, the 70s punks who carried that torch intellectually, right? So, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Speaking of, did you ever consider writing this around punk albums that influenced you, or was I'm curious. I majored in music in college. Rock music is kind of my heart and soul, my niche. I love talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I mean, it certainly was a thought, but I think I just had to stay true to, yes. I mean, I think it's not that it's not that I considered it, but I think it could have been an exercise, in some ways. Like, I think there's like an emotional and intellectual layer for me that I was able to tap into through books that I think as far as music goes, like for me, like music, I think felt more wholly emotional, so it was like if I was feeling sad or if I was feeling happy, like it was always like, I'm going to listen to my favorite song, or this is the song that cheers me up. But like the intellectual piece, like the piece of like, how do I make sense of relationships, or like, where do I fit in this like larger society, like things like that. Like, I didn't get that from music, and I'm not saying that a person cannot. It just wasn't for me. Like for me, like I was just like, music is emotional, and I'm just going to go to that place when I need like an emotional sort of salve. Whereas like I think literature sort of fired on more cylinders for me for whatever reason. But yeah,
No,
I think it's super interesting.
that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Literature is wholly effective in a totally different way. Same with visual art. Same with movement, music. I Thank you. That was really
Thanks.
awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think there's that, I can't remember the author, but Blinded by the Light, like he wrote that book. It was a memoir, and it was like about his like obsession with Bruce Springsteen. And I think every chapter is named after a Springsteen song, I think. And then it got turned into a movie. I'm sorry, I can't remember the author.
No, I can't think I can picture the cover though.
Yeah.
Blue or something.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
No. So in your teen years, I think that most people start to realize that the world is not what we thought it was as a child. Especially I can only really speak from the perspective of a young woman. My teen years were where I realized, like, oh my God, this world is deeply misogynistic. There's so much sexism. And you kind of have that come to Jesus moment about it in high school, working at the gas station, where you realize, oh, this is racism. Racism has a name. This is, I can put a definition to all of the things that we have misnamed, things that we have brushed off, things that we have misinterpreted. So I would love to hear just a little bit about what it was like to write that, and to revisit that feeling. Was it a betrayal? Was it like a relief? Like, oh my God, now I have names for what's happening, and now I can address it. Did it help you address these things when they happened to you? And
yeah.
do you have, sorry, I wrote notes down.
It's okay. No, it's okay.
Do you think that it has helped you, realizing it in your teen years versus, living your life pretending up through, your well into your adulthood? Do you think it helped you sort of address these things as they happen and before they happen? Do you think it's made you a better friend to people who perhaps don't know any better? And do you think it's made you a better ally to other marginalized groups?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, like that big, so, that the incident that you're talking about, and actually just that whole period, like I sort of put under the umbrella or named after the chapter, the autobiography of Malcolm X, like that was like the first time I was a senior in high school, and I, read that book, sort of extracurricularly. It wasn't assigned at school, and it just like it blew my mind. I was like, oh, like structural racism, like systemic racism, like that's a thing, and then I kept, thinking like, but this was written in the 60s. Like, how could that, is that still like happening? And, and it just so happened that like I had a series of events that happened right around that time also that sort of slotted into, right, this like idea of like, oh, like this is what racism is. Oh, I see. Like I think prior to that, like, our punk rock definition of racism was just like, like white supremacists, like Nazi skinheads, so like that seemed easy, and it's not to say that they're not, but like the definition is more complicated, and I think even in that chapter, like I implicate, myself and like my family and my friends, and I think that was the first time, like I think that my brother and I like realized that like my parents, like had carried, sort of like these like sort of anti-Black feelings, and we're like, what is that? And I think my parents, never talked about racism in the way that we did, especially not like as America. Like they didn't talk about like racism as a thing in America. Like, my parents are like super patriots, because they're so grateful to the United States, for giving us a home and evacuating us, and for the, people who sponsored us. And so in my parents' eyes, like any critique of Carlisle or of the United States, which was just ungrateful, and it didn't come from a good place, and I would argue that, my brother and I like actually think America is an incredible place, and that is why we also feel like we need to bring attention to its shortcomings, right? That like we just want the thing that we have been sold and signed up for to match the product description, right? Like it's like you bought the thing on eBay and you're like, wait a second, like this doesn't match the description of the, but like you said, it's a meritocracy, and if I just work hard enough, this and this happens, and all those things. So
Right.
yeah so
No, it's always really eye-opening for me as a white woman who grew up in southern New Hampshire, which is as lily white as it comes, to know cognitively that these things happen to friends, to neighbors, to loved ones, and seeing it written down, it really drives it home, I think, for those of us who it's easy for us to pretend, especially around here, that that's not a problem we have. There certainly, especially recently, has been that emotional feeling in many of my friends, neighbors, colleagues, community members, that I can't believe that this is happening here. I can't believe that people experience microaggressions where I live, where I work, but it happens every day. And I was really struck by your alumni interview with the guy from UPenn, where he really introduced the idea of this model minority, that you're not the model minority. Like Asian people are supposed to be this and that, and Vietnamese people are supposed to be whatever I decide they are. You need to do better to match my stereotype. That is totally jarring.
yeah.
And I know it doesn't do any good, but like, I'm sorry it happened to you. But
No, thanks. Yeah. And and I mean, I think it's so amazing to think about like the idea of whether, like, I don't know, like I didn't grow up around other Asian kids. So like, I didn't even know about the stereotype of like Asians being good at math. Like I didn't learn that until much later. I was like, oh, that's a thing, because, well, I mean, because if there's not like a critical mass of us, like nobody
exactly.
says
So
it,
who's gonna sit there and decide that that's the joke to make, right?
Yeah, no, totally. And I, in some ways, like I'm like, oh, like was that a good thing that like I wasn't aware of it until much later, or not? Like I think about like my daughters, like we're doing so much to sort of raise them to be aware of some stereotypes, but I think in other ways to not talk about them, because like I think like once the idea is out there, like it can sort of like start to feel like, like you're aware of it now, right? Like and so in some ways, like I think there are some things where we just like, what, like I don't even want you to think that people think that girls can or can't do this. Like I just do your thing. So like when they watched Mulan, the animated movie, You know, they're like for like 85 minutes or 75 minutes of the movie, it's like a 90-minute movie. Like it's just like people like just like crapping on Mulan, and my daughters are like, "What is wrong with this? Why are you showing this to us?" You know, like you think like, oh, Disney made this like girl power, you know, animated film, but she really doesn't really sort of come into her own or you know sort of exhibit girl power until like the last 15 minutes. You know, but it's like 70 minutes, 75 minutes of just like people just being like, you know, totally, you know, horrible to her. So I think, you know, in some ways, like I think growing up in this like weird vacuum where I wasn't aware of some stereotypes maybe was helpful because like, and also just my sort of natural oppositional defiance disorder. I don't know, like I was just like, whatever people say I am, I'm not. Like I'm gonna do the opposite. So
no, I what you said about your daughters watching Mulan just made me think of what you said earlier about Catcher in the Rye. You know, for some people it ages all right, and they still see what they saw in it before, and then for kids who are reading it now, it's like, oh my God, what is this?
yeah,
Why do we do this?
for sure, for sure.
Sorry,
No. I have a question for you. Like, if you would you say that if you wrote a memoir, you would filter it through music, or would you filter it through books, or would you do like a combination?
Ooh, that's a very good question. It would probably be through albums. I don't know that it would be any one particular genre, and I don't know that it would even be an album. It might be like one song or one piece of music. I grew up playing classical piano. I grew up singing in choirs and doing musical theater, and now as a bookseller, which, you know, I also wrote all the time as a kid. I wrote a lot of poetry in high school and college. I took creative writing classes. The fact that I'm here is kind of strange to me sometimes. Like, oh my God, I get paid to touch the written word all day. Somebody will give me a book and tell me to read it and tell them what I think. My God, this is incredible. It probably would be music. I think that if I was to have to sit there and write about my life, there are so many pivotal albums that came out in conjunction with strange things in my life that have happened. First time I experienced death, it was I was probably in the 6th grade. It was my favorite aunt who passed away after a 9-year battle with cancer, and My Chemical Romance came out with the Black Parade, and they had a track called Cancer, and I remember listening to that going, oh my God, this is what this is. This is what this is supposed to be. And I think that everybody has that moment with some piece of art. It could be a film that you saw right when you needed it. I think art has a way of finding you when you're
for sure.
the most.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's like the nature of being vulnerable, right? That you're more open or susceptible to the power of art, right? I mean,
Well said.
you know,
Absolutely.
I think so. So, and also, I mean, like, you know, like shout out to like Gerard Way for being like a paradoxical, complicated person, right? I mean, like,
oh my God, so many musicians that I love and admire. You can't pigeonhole them. Gerard Way, Max Bemis, they both write books or write comics and also create musical art. It's insane. And then you look at people like Tom Morell and you're like, oh my God, you graduated from Harvard with a degree in political science, and now you're in this phenomenal band playing bass, just screaming about authority. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, for sure.
I loved your graduation speech, by the way.
Oh God, thanks. Oh my gosh.
It's basically the 17-year-old me would have been like, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
As an adult, I don't want to give up my physical souvenirs. I don't want to give up the photographs and the things that I constantly stress about because I have no room in my tiny apartment. And you hold on to them anyway. So revisiting that graduation speech, does the experience of age and life and now being a parent and now having, 20 some odd years between then and now, does that change your perspective, and does that change what you would have written if you had to rewrite that speech today?
Oh yeah, I totally would have. I mean, it was so, and I, going back to the idea of like, whatever you're afraid to write that, like it was so I read that and I was like, because I have a copy of it and it was so cringy and I was like, oh my God, like I was so, am I allowed to use light profanity on this video?
Gentle profanity.
I was like, oh, I was such a douche. I was like, oh, what is wrong with you? But then also again, right, to go back to this idea, like I'm not gonna be revisionist. Like if this is what I wrote, like I'm gonna put it out there, and then also to kind of like pull back the curtain and say like, yeah, and I was feeling really angry and like fed up with my town, and like just I wanted to like get out of there. And I offered nothing personal about myself at all. Like I said nothing, and I, yes, I mean, if I could write it now, it would be my TED talk, right? Like it was, like so, like so like that gap between like my graduation speech and the TED talk from 2012. Like I didn't do any public speaking or anything like that, and in a weird way, like I thought, like in 2012, like that was like my chance to really get up on the stage and be vulnerable and talk about like sort of the most personal things in my life, right? Like growing up in a small town and like being a refugee and discovering great books in punk rock and all that stuff. So but it takes so much work to get up yourself. I'll speak for myself. It took so much work to get myself to a place where I could talk about that on stage in front of strangers. Yeah, so.
No, absolutely. I think that TED talk, the way you just described it, that is the moment of greatness that you probably were striving for. Whether
Thanks.
or not, right?
Thanks.
It's that moment where you can say something and somebody will listen, and somebody out there is going to understand what you tried to say. And whether or not it's the intended audience, somebody out there really understood what you tried to say. I don't think it resonated and spread so far if somebody didn't hear your words.
Thanks. And the great irony is that like like in that moment, or in unpacking the TED talk, like I had to be sort of my most authentic self, right? And which is the scary thing, right? Because like I think people could just be like, "Ugh, like your authentic self is gross," or like I don't want to hear your authentic story, which is totally a possibility. But it's also, again, it's that idea of like being vulnerable and being open to share, that part of sharing, right? And listening and having people listen to you. Yeah.
When you were writing this, and I know that you've written in your acknowledgments, like, I don't want my daughters to touch this well into their teen years, and they have the ability to grasp the nuance of all of the great and shitty things that I did as a child.
Right.
Has having kids and being a parent and being engaged with your family, especially right now during quarantine, has that given you a new perspective on who you were then, and has it changed? Not necessarily changed. That was a poor choice of words.
Oh, it's okay.
If you could go back and tell your 17-year-old self something, now that you've learned, and now that you're a parent, not that your 17-year-old self would listen, because we never listen to grown-ups, but what would you tell yourself if you could?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I think I would say that that it's okay to take yourself seriously. Like I think like it's just, there's like this funny phenomenon that happens culturally where I think we write off teenagers, and we all do it. Like, we roll our eyes at teenagers, and like when like you hear like a teenager complain about how he's got the wrong brand of sneakers, or someone says, oh, like they have the wrong mismatched socks and that's ruined their day. I mean, like there's like hyperbole in there, but also like that might be their reality, right? And there's just a lot of eye rolling from adults, or like when you hear adults talk about like, oh, well, look out, like little Johnny's got his driver's license, like the streets won't be safe. Or like even like if you're at a restaurant and like a horde of teenagers come in and they sit down at the table next to you, and you're just like, oh no, this is going to be bad. If we replace teenagers with basically any other group, like Black people or women, like it would just never fly. And yet culturally, right, like there's this period where like we as a society all decide that it's totally okay to like beat up and like verbally abuse and culturally sort of marginalize teenagers, and it's not great, because I think they're literally about to be adults, like like at 18, right? Like they're legally adults, and yet here we are, like we're putting them through the fire of like 5-6 years of just being treated terribly by everybody. And I'm not sure if we're doing anybody a great service by that. Like I would love to see culturally, if we could move away or move towards like a place where we were kinder to teenagers and more compassionate and recognize that like they're going through all these like crazy, biological changes that they don't have any control over. And be kind, because that's certainly not our cultural template now. I think maybe I'm making is that your experience? Maybe I'm sort of misremembering how I felt as a teenager and how we treat teenagers. We're not nice to them, I don't think.
Certainly not. And I think part of it is, you're right, like we hear them, complain and whine because, this one tiny thing is happening. But when you're a teenager, physiologically, all of your emotions are right here. They're all at the top because your brain is learning how to process them. Everything feels life or death because not only is it the first time you've gone through it, but it feels like it is life or death. It's just how your body physically reacts. And before this, I worked in restaurants. And so, part of it is like when you mentioned, you complain when a group of teenagers sits down. Teenagers were never the people that I was ever that worried about.
That's good.
Really gonna tip? No, they weren't gonna. But I knew that going into it. They at least would be kind to me, and they would say nice things about what I was wearing. So I'll take what I can get. I think that we forget that they're learning. We forget that they haven't got all of the experience that we have, and they haven't learned how to tip their waitress. All they know is say please and thank you and be polite. And that's something that many adults forget.
Yeah.
I think that you're right, that we do have to be kinder to teenagers. It's fun to poke fun, but at the same time, who's hearing that and who is digesting what we're saying and who is taking that truly to heart.
Yeah, and I think about the important and formative, adult relationships that I had when I was when I was a teenager, and they were all with my teachers who treated me with respect, and like listened to what I had to say, even if it was like a dumb idea. Like those, that for me, like that was so formative, and I can only imagine, right? Like I would imagine that for you too, right? Like, or anybody, right? Like you remember the teachers who like took you seriously and like took the time to like listen to you and actually, honor your opinions about things.
Oh, it made a huge difference for me. Like I said, I grew up doing musical theater at the former American Stage Festival. Now it's the Amato Center. And having directors that I could call by their first names and address like a peer and have them address me like a peer. Yes, they were in a position of authority. Yes, if they said something, I still had to follow the rules. But at the same time, they also weren't talking down to me. They wanted me to grow as an artist. They wanted me to be a person that they could have artistic conversations with. I think that makes a world of difference for teenagers. I think you're absolutely right. And I think your students are very, very fortunate to have been in your classroom.
Oh, thanks. So wait. So let's close this loop. So do you think that is, what do you think that disconnect is that is growing with Catcher in the Rye and like kids nowadays? I don't know if you're aware of that or if you've read that.
I read it in high school, and I didn't love Holding Caulfield. Just as a person, I'm like, you're so into yourself, get over it. But I think that part of it is Holding Caulfield, he doesn't really have a ton of empathy for others. And I think that for better or for worse, because we're all connected through social media, it's easier for kids, for my students when I was teaching lessons and things like that, for people that age to feel connected to others and to feel like, your triumphs are my triumphs. My favorite YouTuber is sharing his engagement or whatever. That's my triumph to celebrate with him. Or somebody just got dumped and they posted about it on their Instagram, and I am going through that with them now. For better or for worse, I think that kids are more empathetic, and part of it is that Holding Caulfield he cares, but he doesn't. He doesn't know how to show that he cares.
Which is also like a teenage conundrum, right? That like.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think part of it too is that, he's not pleasant. He whines all the time. And when we do it, we love to think that, when we complain, it's different than when somebody else complains. And I've grown up this all the time too.
Yeah. Yeah.
My situation is different from your situation. You shouldn't whine about yours, but it's okay if I whine about mine. And I
Right.
think that's part of it too, is that the things that Holding Caulfield is upset about, the things that he is feeling existential ennui about, those are not things that students, especially, I grew up in a small town. When you were describing Carlisle, I was reminded of Milford. It is a small town. There's not a ton going on, kind of sleepy. One school, I remember, I can't relate to this at all. Holding Caulfield lives in New York City. He goes to New York City and he does all of these adult things that he's not supposed to do. I can't relate to that at all. I have no desire to do any of that. I have no desire to go to the city. Why do you have to go to the city to figure yourself out? Just don't be so dramatic about it.
Right.
I think part of it is that because of the things that he did and the things that he was going through as a character, it's not something that most kids experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not as universal as it was when it was written.
Sure. Right. Yeah, right. Because now we're like, 50 years removed, right? More than that, right?
It seems like a very simple thing, and like it shouldn't matter that much, but like it does. If that's not your reality, you can't relate to it.
Right. For sure.
I don't know. I haven't thought about Catcher in the Rye in a really long time.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just so. I think it's fascinating to watch books, sort of come in and out of, sort of like the canon, like Mark Twain and things like that. And I'm sure at some point Shakespeare, kids are going to be like, ugh, like nobody's reading Shakespeare anymore.
Right.
And there's some loss, but I think it's also amazing to think about like revisiting those ideas, right, and revisiting the canon and what books are speaking to people. And it's not like they're undiscoverable, that like it just takes one person to discover the right book at the right time, as you were saying, a piece of art. And it could be anything. It could be something from, the ancient Greeks, or, it could be My Chemical Romance.
Oh, let's not advertise that I was an emo kid in high school.
I'm just saying, one may discover My Chemical Romance, not you.
Could be me, or
right.
It could be something.
Who knows?
Speaking of books in the Western canon, is there anything that recently you revisited that maybe formerly you didn't enjoy or you didn't quite understand, that in the maybe past 5 or 10 years that you read again or encountered again and were like, oh my God, never mind, this is mind-blowing?
I reread all of the books that I told my book through as I was writing it, just to refresh my memory. And boy, Scarlet Letter is so good. Like, it is so good. And it hasn't, I liked it even more. Like, I loved all the books in that were my Lens books. But I was really struck by how good Scarlet Letter is. And although I'd say there's like this opening chapter, I think it's like 50-ish pages, called The Custom House. And
yep.
Yeah, it's very weird. I remember reading that this time through and I was like, what is this? And then I did a little research and realized that like that was like this whole thing that he added onto because he was so insecure about the book being too short. Basically, it was like filler. You're nodding your head because I was like, you don't even really need to read The Custom House. You could just skip that and go straight into like the story.
I was absolutely supposed to read it in school, and I absolutely skipped it because
The Custom House, yeah.
I had absolutely no desire to mess with it. I was like, I know what the Custom House is. I've been to Salem. I've seen it. I get the gist. Moving on.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's very strange.
That was another book I had to revisit as an adult in my post-college years before I think I really appreciated it.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you formerly loved that you now as an adult are indifferent to or don't quite feel the same pull to?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, so it's funny, like my wife and I both sort of bonded over our love of Salinger. And, like I recently like revisited, like I was just reading some of his short fiction and I was like, I don't know, like it's not aging for me well. But that also may change, right? Like, but I'm reading more I'm in a book club, so I'm reading a lot more 20th and 21st century writing than I ever have, just, by dint of being like a Latin teacher, I just end up reading a lot of like ancient works of literature. So it's, and if I have free time, like I'd rather read like Dickens, it's one of my all-time favorites. Not for everybody, but I love Dickens. And so, yeah, so like just reading a lot of modern stuff, like I just, like Anne Patchett, I think it's like, I'm just discovering her now, and like, it's so amazing. And like, now I just want to read everything she's ever written. So that's really exciting. And then just reading more sort of contemporary things too. Like, right now we're reading Transcendent Kingdom, for our book club, and that's pretty interesting. Really good, really good.
Good pick too. That's like brand new. That only just came out
Yeah.
a month ago.
Yeah. My book club is really, they're pretty voracious, and they're just like, okay, what are people talking about? We're gonna read that. So
No, you gotta keep it fresh. I mean, and there's no shortage of great literature, and some people balk at calling a lot of books literature, but no, it is. Maybe it's not Dickens, but I think that there's a lot of merit to addressing books as books, even if it's, a romance novel, like all the Jasmine Guillory books. A friend of mine's a librarian. She never used to read romance. She never used to read like women's literature. She's like, oh, it's not real literature. And this pandemic, she's like, all right, I'm gonna give it a try. And she's like, there's so much more nuance and depth to these than I ever appreciated before, than I ever wanted to acknowledge. And I think it's very fitting. I think it speaks to, you can't put literature into one particular box.
Right. For sure.
So it is 5 of 5. If any of you guys have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask, and I will facilitate that. Oh, Jesus. My colleague just walked past me. I had another thought. I wrote it down earlier, and now I'm trying to remember what it was. And you kind of answered it with your book club question, but I was going to say, is there anything that you read recently that really spoke to you and that you want to read a second time?
Oh man, yeah, I read my book club. We read Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here, and have you read that?
Yes.
I loved it. I loved it so much. I read it in like 2 days, and then when it was over, I wish that I hadn't read it so quickly. That was pretty amazing.
Really, truly a great job. It's
I loved it.
So out there.
Yeah.
But it's also not out there at all. Like,
no, it's so great. It was great.
He describes everything as perfectly imagined.
Yeah. It's really great.
Megan says that she's been wanting to reread the Scarlet Letter, and she's been really intimidated, so she knows to just skip the first part. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. You're welcome, Megan. I would skip Custom House and just go straight into the story, and it's really, really readable. I think, like, there's not, like, the language isn't like too torturous, and boy, I love Hester Prynne more than ever. I mean, she's so defiant, and and just so tough. There's like a kind of, and it's very specifically Yankee to me. Like, it feels like there's a kind of like New England grit to her, that I think is really particular to that book. But anyway, I don't know. Yeah.
No, Hester Prynne is an enduring protagonist. No matter what something gets thrown at her, I mean, she sticks with it, and I think that's very New England.
Yeah.
You have to be up here. I mean, are freezing. We used to get feet and feet and feet of snow.
Right.
It was hard to do anything. I mean, you look at New Hampshire and it's all rock, it's all granite. You have to be very you have to have a lot of fortitude, I think.
Yeah. For sure. It's not for this is not the place to lie under a palm tree and like sip a fruity drink, right?
I think about that a lot.
Yeah, right. That's what vacations are for.
Exactly. Thank you so much for coming, for doing this event with us. Thank you again for letting me record it. Folks, if you haven't read this book, if you haven't seen his TED Talk, go on YouTube, look at the TED Talk, come to the Toadstool or toadbooks.com. Please read the book. I cannot say enough good things about it. Thank you so much. It has been a personal pleasure too to get to chat with you.
Thanks, Katrina.
Chat about your writing. I've really, really enjoyed this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And please be safe and enjoy your fall. Hope you get some leaf peeping in there. It's beautiful
Thank
out there
you.
right now. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Alrighty.
Have a great night. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you too. Alrighty. Take care. Bye.
Bye.